Hello, welcome to the webinar on diversity and inclusion. Thank you all for coming. My name is Isabel Guimarães, and I will open this webinar on behalf of Professor Eva Dias de Oliveira. Professor Eva masterminded the whole webinar, but due to a ghastly throat operation last week, she's not able to speak. You will be stuck with me then. But it is now time to introduce our guest speakers. We thank Julia and Dawn for accepting our invitation to join us today and talk about diversity and inclusion in human resources management. It is really a privilege to have you both with us today. Julia Hodgson, our first speaker, is a professor at University of Liverpool. And in today's presentation, Julia will discuss the topic from an academic point of view. Her departing question is to know whether diversity, inclusion, and equality are simply three managerial buzzwords or key organizational features aiming to promote healthy workplaces. With Julia, we also are delighted to welcome Dawn Nicholson from the University of Kent. Dawn still will share her views on diversity and inclusion, drawing on a 20-year-long professional career as human resource consultant at Arthur Andersen, but she was also managing director, deputy head of human resources for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa for the global investment bank Morgan Stanley for 16 years. Before joining academia, Dawn was a partner at one of the big four, PricewaterhouseCoopers. And now, without further ado, we'll start this session with Julia from the University of Liverpool. So I bid you all your attention, please. Thank you.
Julia? Thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks very much. And hello, everyone. It's my privilege to be here and to discuss issues related to diversity and inclusion with you. My name is Julia Hodgson, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Liverpool. And I'll begin by sharing my screen now with you so we can go through the presentation. All right, so I believe that you can see my presentation now and that you'll be able to hear me as well, but any problems, please do let me know. So yes, as I mentioned, I'm very happy to be here with you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I understand that some of you may be preparing an assignment in the area of diversity and inclusion, and I hope this presentation and this conference today will be helpful to you in your presentations in having you think around some of the concepts of diversity and inclusion, both from an academic point of view and from a practitioner point of view. And so maybe what we're discussing today will give you some ideas for your assignment as well. Now, with my students, I lecture in diversity and inclusion, both undergraduate and postgraduate. And I always start by appreciating that our study of diversity and inclusion takes place in a wider context, in a wider society. What we do in organizations doesn't just happen in a vacuum, and what's going on outside of organizations is just as important for us thinking about what's going on inside the organization. And certainly, now is a very, very interesting time to think about issues of diversity and inclusion in a wider sense. There are many issues, many current events, news items that can help us to appreciate diversity and inclusion, both inside and outside of an organization. So just as an example, to get us thinking along these lines, last year, President Biden, for example, was elected as president. A new Democratic Party came into office, and he, in some ways of looking at it, he did run on a platform that was more open to diversity and inclusion than, say, his predecessor did. One of the things that he said in his acceptance speech was, We must make the promise of the country real for everybody, no matter their race, their ethnicity, their faith, their identity, or their disability. Again, which is something that his predecessor, President Trump, didn't do. I think we could argue that he wasn't a proponent for diversity, for example, building a wall or banning people from mostly Muslim countries coming into America. But with President Biden, he started by giving a message that he's trying to make the country work for everyone. And with diversity, in a similar way in organizations, we're trying to make diversity, through diversity and inclusion and equality, we're trying to find a way to make organizations work for everyone, regardless of their backgrounds, their needs and their skills. And there was a lot of excitement around the president and his selection of his government and who he was appointing last year. Especially again, compared to the previous administration. What we have now on this screen are photographs of the cabinet. There's President Trump on the top, and he's surrounded by his cabinet. And then in the bottom are photographs of his team. And when they're in black and white, that represents an older male, white man. And then in color, we have someone whose background is different, where we have some diversity. And there was a lot of excitement around the change in the cabinet that President Biden's administration brought in, with more diversity, with more women, ethnic minorities, LGBT. So we had with Biden the first openly gay cabinet secretary, the first female Treasury Secretary, the first Black Pentagon chief, and more. And of course, we had the first female vice president who was of Black and Asian background. So why is there all this interest in diversity in that way? Why would having a diverse cabinet matter? And it's argued, and research suggests that there is value in bringing in this diversity, and also I think you could relate in terms of face validity of this as well. That bringing in diversity means that you will have people from different backgrounds who can bring in different ideas and priorities to the government, and that ultimately should mean that the government creates better policies and speaks to the experience of all the population that it represents. And also we can see the role models here, that when you see a woman or a Black man or a gay man or woman in these positions for the first time, maybe it starts to change people's expectations of the types of people that are expert in these roles, and it provides a role model from people from other backgrounds thinking, they can see it, they can be it too. So we're beginning to think about why diversity matters when we look at this example. Of course, it's also an interesting time to think about diversity, inclusion, equality, because at the moment there's more awareness and there have been protests around issues, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, #MeToo movement, the inequalities around COVID. That's made people more aware of issues related to diversity and inclusion. And it certainly has raised people's consciousness, and it's forced people to have conversations about race and racism and sexual harassment and inequalities in organizations and outside of organizations. And some organizations now say that they support Black Lives Matter, which is a huge commitment. And likewise, again, with #MeToo, they're thinking about their procedures and policies around harassment. So again, lots of discussion then that has brought more of a focus on the issue of diversity than maybe ever before. But having said that, of course, not everyone necessarily embraces diversity and inclusion, and you may have your own views. We've certainly seen culture wars around cancel culture, political correctness, wokeness. I find for my students, young people like you, they tend to be more progressive than previous generations. Your generation is taking a stand for the environment, for climate change. Your generation is more anti-racist and anti-sexist, anti-homophobia. So when I talk to my students in the UK about diversity, it matters to them. Justice is important for them, economic, social, environmental justice. So the work that we're doing that you may do in your future roles as managers in equality, diversity, inclusion, that can make a difference. Probably some of the other topics that you're also aware of, maybe through the news or through discussion, that are also relevant to diversity and inclusion are topics like the pay gap and glass ceiling and bullying and harassment as in general. And when we address inequalities like this, again, it falls within our brief of diversity and inclusion. And so research into these areas and thinking about how we can address the pay gap, how we can break through the glass ceiling, what we can do around bullying and harassment is part of the whole brief of diversity and inclusion. Okay, so sorry. With that as a background, some of the questions that I'd like to consider with you in this webinar is to think, first of all, to set the scene, what do we mean by diversity, inclusion, and equality? In practice, these terms can be used interchangeably, but from an academic point of view, we do make distinctions. So I'd like to consider that with you. And then having understood sort of what they are, we can think about, do they matter? Why do they matter? Are they just words, or is there something substantial behind it? And also to begin to think about what organizations can do to build a culture that reflects diversity and inclusion. And I think our next speaker is probably going to pick up on some of those points. All right, so to start off then, let's think about what we mean by diversity, inclusion, and equality. So diversity, simply put, is difference. Diversity means varied and different. And it's a recognition that everyone is different, that everyone is unique. Everyone here at this webinar has something unique about them, that no one is bringing to this webinar the same experience and background and interests than anyone else. And so even if we have identical twins here today, you could argue that they still bring a diversity. So diversity then focuses on those differences that distinguish us from one another. Sometimes these differences are contextual, defined through societal constructs. So in discussion, we may be aware that gender, race, those are constructs, and that can change, and our self-identity around those constructs can also change. But in terms of thinking about what diversity is then, in terms of these characteristics that make us different, we can see that it can refer to any number of characteristics, some of which I've listed here. Often when you ask people about diversity, they'll respond about thinking about race and ethnicity and gender, and those are important aspects of diversity. But also it includes so many more, hundreds of characteristics, such as sexual orientation, education, language, physical appearance. Some aspects of our diversity are visible and people can more or less tell from looking at us. Other aspects are more invisible and you don't know that aspect of diversity until someone tells you. Some of these aspects we may have no control over. We have no control over our age, but other aspects maybe we do have a little more control than others. So in defining diversity, we can see that it's about the heterogeneity amongst all of us, that it applies to everyone. So a white man is still part of the conversation because that's his diversity, and his buy-in and his understanding is going to be important for us in terms of diversity, inclusion, and equality. So there are potentially so many different characteristics to research, to consider when it comes to diversity. But it's these ones that tend to get the most focus in terms of research. And it's because these ones have a special focus in terms of the law. These are protected characteristics usually under equality legislation. And so we find that a lot of our research and these characteristics are important, but because they have that legal focus, a lot of the research is around race and ethnicity and gender, etc. Often, if you look in diversity management, diversity inclusion textbook, they'll have chapters on these areas. So that tends to be sort of when I'm teaching it, I'll have lectures a topic will be on these areas. And it's not to say that other areas aren't important. And of course, as the law changes, it can take research into different directions along with the law. All right, so that's a bit about diversity. What about inclusion? How is that different from diversity? Because we may have diversity in our organization, but we may not have inclusion. Diversity is just the beginning of the story. It's not the end of the story, because researchers, when they've looked at organizations that have diversity of staff and compare them to other organizations that maybe don't have the same level, we may not necessarily find that the diverse organizations are more effective. They have improved performance, because what's missing is inclusion. And in the literature, inclusion refers to the efforts and the practices in which people from different backgrounds feel. It's their sense of feeling accepted and welcomed and treated equally. So it's their sense of belonging, and whether the organization creates that culture of belonging. So, back up here. Sometimes these analogies are used to explain the difference between diversity and inclusion. So diversity is like the ingredients, and having more ingredients in makes it more interesting. But inclusion is when they're working together in the salad. Or diversity is being invited to the party, and that's important, but inclusion is being asked to dance. So that's one way. And then finally, equality. And again, if we're going to make a distinction between diversity, inclusion, and equality, equality has a legal focus. So here we're looking at the legislation. It's about providing opportunities for individuals by protecting them from being discriminated against. So equality is the area that sets a minimum standard in our organizations that it's designed to address overt discrimination, harassment, and victimization. And the legislation grew out of movements. So the legislation has evolved, beginning, say, in the 70s with the women's liberation movement and the civil rights movement. So in the 70s, we started to see legislation protecting against discrimination for sex and for and for race. And then in the 90s, we brought in legislation against disability discrimination. And then more recently, in the 2000s, we've had discrimination legislation for religion and sexual orientation. So again, just to consider each three, to summarize what we've said as we're beginning to think about what diversity and inclusion are, we can see how they have sort of a different function within the organization. Diversity refers to recognizing the differences between people. So its functioning is to consider that as it could be a valuable part of an organization, to recognize and respect differences. Inclusion, by contrast, we've said, has to do with belonging, and that's its function. So it refers to an individual's experience in the workplace. And then equality is providing protection from discrimination, and that's its function. So whilst the terms can be used interchangeably, we can make distinctions from an academic point of view. So taking this forward, let's think about how they matter. So having set this out, why do diversity, inclusion, and equality matter? Well, we could say that taken together, they're important because it's through equality, diversity, and inclusion that we're going to create a workplace that's fair, right? Where people are treated fairly and not discriminated against, where individuals and their backgrounds are valued, and where employees feel a sense of belonging. And that matters. That matters because there's a business case for diversity and inclusion, and there's a social justice case for diversity and inclusion. And that's what I'd like to talk through with you next, starting with our business case. There is a great deal of research looking at organizations that have diversity. So looking at the statistics and how it performs, and finding what the levels of diversity of the staff are in the organization. And once we've measured that, then we can then look for correlations in other areas. So there's a lot of research that, and in that way. Research also, we can compare how groups perform on an experimental basis. So we can have a homogeneous group and a heterogeneous group of subjects, and we can give them a task and we can see how they perform. And together, the results from a great deal of research has found that there is a business case, we could say, for diversity around talent, around group performance and innovation, around corporate sort of responsibility and reputation, and finally around financial performance as well. So in the next slides, I'd like to share a little bit of that research, what the findings are for these 4 areas, again, drawing on that rich research for the business case. So starting with talent, and here I think you can probably make connections between what you're studying in organizational behavior and diversity and inclusion. In the area of talent, I think that there's face validity to the notion that if you create a workspace where people are valued for their diversity, where people can come into work and they're treated fairly in that, and they're not discriminated against, they don't face bullying and harassment as a minimum, but beyond that, they're valued for their experiences and the skills that they have, and they're given an opportunity to achieve their ambitions, to reach their potentials. In that kind of organization, on the face of it, that would be the kind of organization that people would want to work for. And indeed, research does find that recruitment, that it is important, it can lead to better recruitment and retention in the workforce. A lot of research, especially for younger people like yourselves, having an organization with diversity policies does make a difference. It's something that they're looking for in the organizations. And it should follow on that if it's that kind of climate where people are valued, where they have opportunity, there are correlations between our measures of job satisfaction and organizations that have diversity, as well as commitment, as well as having a climate of trust. And it's going to be the environment, again, it follows where we have greater levels of productivity. And this is where our diversity is working well. It would be an organization where there's less stress if there's less bullying and harassment, for example. So we should see lower levels of absenteeism and lower turnover. Lots of areas there then that link into your studies of organizational behavior. Another advantage, another case to be made for diversity and why it's important is that it links to our innovation and group performance, that when we compare in an experimental setting, say, the quality of decisions that are made by a diverse group compared to a less diverse group, they're coming up with better quality decisions. Diversity is good for creativity, for out-of-the-box thinking. It also can be helpful in terms of matching our consumer needs to what we're developing within the organization. There would be better alignment when you have a wider range of people representing the gender, race, and other aspects of your customer group. Some research also suggests that where diversity is working well, it can solve problems faster. Okay. And then there's the area of reputation and responsibility. Organizations that manage diversity and inclusion well also improve their reputation for being responsible employers. And research, shows that customers are interested to buy products from organizations that are known for being diverse. And there's areas as well that have looked at what is the link between having a diverse workforce and financial performance. And this gets a lot of interest and attention. And there is research to find that kind of correlation, that when you compare organizations that have higher levels of diversity, they perform better financially in almost every measure of financial performance. And that certainly gets a lot of attention. So there are many areas to be developed. But with often the focus becomes on, okay, why should we have a diverse workforce? Well, at the end of the day, in just one word, people focus on this notion that perhaps it's good for profit. And it's important that our organizations, of course, do survive and that they are profitable. But there's another case for diversity, or not another one, it's not mutually exclusive, but in addition to profit, the case for diversity in just one other word is people. And I think that from what we've said, we can appreciate that from beyond the focus on profit, there's non-financial benefits from diversity as well. And that leads us to another important area for thinking about diversity, that there's a social justice case around diversity and inclusion. Not only is it may be good for business when it's done well, but it's also the right thing to do. So, at a minimum, what we're saying is that, people, at a minimum, you want to be able to go to work, to be yourself, to get on with your job, to not be discriminated against, and to be valued, for who you are, regardless of your background, and to achieve your ambition. And at a minimum, we should be making a culture where that is the case, and where everyone has that opportunity to develop. And so, there is a moral argument that beyond just complying to the law, we want to create that kind of workspace where people have access to employment, where they can develop their careers, where they can train in an environment that's free from discrimination. And indeed, beyond this, more broadly, you can say another aspect of the social justice case for diversity relates to where our ambitions would be if we were to create a world where it was sustainable, where it was a peaceful world and a more equitable world. And you could argue that diversity and inclusion in the work that we do that within organizations is important for that. So you may be aware of the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and those were adopted by 193 countries in 2015, including the UK, including Portugal. And when we look at the work for in diversity and inclusion, a number of those goals can be achieved through good diversity and inclusion practice, such as Goal 3, good health and well-being, Goal 5, gender equality, and so on. So, and I'm conscious of time, so I'll just to leave you with some ideas, which I think our next speaker is going to pick up on. How can organizations build that culture which reflects diversity and practices inclusion? And what our research is saying is that to progress diversity and inclusion, a systematic approach is needed. It's helpful to know that there is a business case for diversity and a social justice case. And it's helpful to know that. What I've discussed is sort of a generic case, a generic business case for diversity. And so what organizations need is to know what the case is for their specific organization. And ideally, organizations would take an evidence-based approach by looking at the data within their own organization. So it's going to require a commitment to look at the whole organization, everything the organization does, collect the data, examine that data, and then understand where there might be barriers to diversity and inclusion and try to address those. So for example, we need to look at our data and say, is there a glass ceiling? How many women senior managers do we have? Is it 50%? If it isn't 50%, why not? What are the barriers? Do women in our organization face discrimination? How many women do we interview for these positions? Is there structural or cultural barriers? Do we need training? Do we need flexible working hours? Do we need to, so it's involved in drilling down from that data into everything the organization does. So we need to have a strategy. It needs to be part of the organization's strategic direction. And research shows that in particular, it's very helpful when the staff working on diversity and inclusion aren't marginalized, but are actually working closely with the senior leadership team. All right, so I'm sure that's more than my time. Just to summarize with just 2 points to take away from what we've said, what we've been discussing is that by being inclusive and supporting diversity, organizations can benefit, yes, and so can individuals, and so can society. And in order to realize those benefits, then we need a commitment for diversity inclusion to be a strategic priority, one that's embedded into the organization's practice and culture and is driven by the data and taking an evidence-based approach. So thank you. I think we have questions at the end, yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Julia, for your enlightening presentation. It was very, very interesting. And now we will hear about what Dawn has to tell us on diversity and inclusion, drawing on her experience. Dawn, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk without slides. So I became involved in diversity in my organization probably back in around about 2000. I worked for a US investment bank, as has been noted. And I think it's fair to say that, first of all, our efforts around diversity were actually driven by our headquarters in the United States, who were probably somewhat ahead of the United Kingdom at that point in the game because of affirmative action. And affirmative action basically had been around in the United States for some time, and obviously was specifically legislated in order to ensure that certain underrepresented groups were given opportunity and presented with supposedly equal opportunities. So that sort of model came to the United Kingdom, first of all, in the banking community. But of course, affirmative action is not something that is actually permissible under UK law and under most of European law. And so we needed to take that sort of messaging and do something different with it. Now, affirmative action is not permissible, but what is permissible is targeted action, if you like. So whilst we couldn't necessarily make a statement that said we will have X% of our workforce as gender, as women, or X% of our senior management will be women by a particular date, we were able to set, along with many organizations, what we described as aspirational targets. And those aspirational targets spanned many areas of diversity. It's fair to say within banking at that point in time, gender diversity was a very big focus. There was a very big desire to increase the representation, in particular, of senior women in the organization. Of course, investment banking back in the early 2000s was a fairly macho male culture. And of course, that macho male culture was subsequently one factor that was blamed, if you like, for the financial crisis as being, something that was at the root of much of what happened. So we spent a lot of our time talking about gender diversity in particular, but that's not to say that we ignored other elements of diversity. At that point in time, we were probably focused on key strands. So we were focused on sexual orientation, we were focused on gender, and we were focused on ethnicity. At that point in time, back in the beginning, it's fair to say that some of the other areas of diversity and inclusion that have just been alluded to weren't as much of a focus. Within an organization like I worked in, really diversity and equality and inclusion thinking needs to span the whole employee life cycle. The word, Julia used the word people, I would use the word talent, only because ultimately the two are interchangeable, but from our perspective, it became about making sure that as an organization, we had access to the best talent, irrespective of where that best talent came from, the gender, the ethnicity, the sexual orientation, whatever of that talent. So we wanted to ensure from the very beginning that we were bringing in the best talent. So of course, that creates a need to start by focusing on your recruitment policies, basically. Recruitment policies can only sort of respond to what's in front of them. So for example, and I think this goes to another point that Julia alluded to, you have to understand what the barriers are, and you have to vary your approach and your strategy. So there's little point in my saying that, if I'm working for Mark Zuckerberg, for example, I want 50% of my workforce to be female. The reality still was then and still is, that there are not very many or not sufficient women who choose to go into tech at this point to fulfill that aspiration. So you've got to kind of modify your aspiration depending on the constraints that you may be working within. But effectively, it starts with recruitment. But I would say it starts actually not with recruitment at the point of entry into an organization like a big 4 firm or a big bank. It starts before that. It starts by basically helping younger people to understand, at the ages of 10, 11, 12, 13, that actually these opportunities are open to them, that you can be a woman who works in banking, that you can be an ethnic minority who becomes, a partner in a big 4 firm. So I think there are important messages that need to be conveyed very early on before people start to make choices. Because once those choices start to be made, it can sometimes be very difficult to take people away from those choices, to bring people out of those choices. So making everyone understand that those opportunities are there, that they can avail themselves of those opportunities is a very important point. And getting that message across at a young age, I think, is also very important. So I think that's point one. The second thing that I would say is recruitment is about turning on a tap. It's like running a bath. If you turn on the tap, but you haven't put in the plug, then the water's going to run out. So this goes to the sort of next stage of the strategy, which is you get your diversity into an organization, you have to retain it. And that's the key point here. There's no point in my bringing diversity into an organization if 5 years down the line, it's all disappeared. And there's no doubt that there are certain elements and certain factors at work that do put diversity under strain as employees move through the life cycle, basically. So then it becomes about what you do as a culture, what you do as an organization to show that you are open to diversity, that you are receptive, that you want a diverse culture. And that is about celebrating diversity and celebrating inclusion, basically. Making people feel welcome, making adjustments, whether it's, changing your gender-related policies, whether it is, creating opportunities for diverse employees to succeed, whether it is showcasing the success of diverse employees, whether it is demonstrating that diverse employees can actually ascend to the highest levels of an organization. These are all important factors. And creating those role models, I think, is really important for people in organizations. You can't be what you can't see is the phrase that's used. And I think that there is some truth in that, basically. When people see diversity higher up above them, then it helps them to believe that they can achieve. I do believe at the beginning that there was a very big focus on the business benefits of diversity. I have to say, I think that has shifted. I think that, people were very focused on productivity. There were lots and lots and lots of statistics that were produced about diversity in organizations, diverse organizations being more productive, blah, 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 all of that. As Julia alluded to, most of that is correlational. I feel that hand was actually a little bit overplayed. And what I've seen certainly over the last kind of 20 odd years or so is a shift. Yes, productivity is important, of course it is. Fundamentally, you achieve productivity through the retention of great talent. And I do think there has become much more of a focus on the moral case, the importance of having diversity from a moral perspective, doing the right thing. And I think that has become increasingly important. I mean, I look at banking now, and in the organization that I worked for, the chief executive of Europe is a woman. The chief executive, the global chief executive of Citibank is a woman. So the changes have been really incredible in that particular organization, those particular organizations, at least from a gender perspective. There are other areas of diversity and inclusion that have some way to go. And challenges have come along and other things have happened and to change the focus. So I think ethnicity has become much more of a focus. I think organizations are much more focused on that now. I see sexual orientation still as being less of a focus for organizations. I think they They talk about it, but I'm not convinced yet that they're doing everything that they could or should do. Age, for example, I see is becoming an increasing focus. A lot of those organizations, are relatively young organizations. They use words like dynamic in their advertising and things of that nature. So I think there's a new challenge there around age. But I think fundamentally they understand the importance of diversity and inclusion and equality, and I think have taken great steps. The banks were basically right at the very beginning of this to begin with. I think now I see, great efforts being made by the big four firms, the professional services firms. I think there are still industries that have some way to go. Tech, I mentioned. I think they've definitely got some places to go. But I think that, there have been great changes over the sort of 20 odd years. The one thing I will say, perhaps just to sort of conclude, is around diversity. You can have all the diversity in the world sitting on a table, but if it's not heard, it's pointless. And so I'm always interested when I see pictures and people show me pictures of, look how great our diverse our board, look how diverse our board is. My question is, do you hear the diversity and do you listen to it? And they're two different things. Do you hear it? Do the diverse people feel empowered to speak? Do you listen to it? Do you listen to their views? Do you process what they say? Do you bring it into play? Do you apply it? It's no good looking at it if you don't listen to it and hear it. And I think, most organizations are doing a good job, but I think that some talk a great talk without necessarily understanding exactly everything that they need to do to make sure that they are hearing the diverse voices and applying the diverse voices and the diverse way of thinking. So there's always room for improvement. I think diversity constantly changes. The definitions of diversity constantly change. Sometimes they're driven legally. I do think this is an important area. I partnered a lot with employment lawyers during my time. And sometimes I think the law can be helpful in driving change. But as I say, I think most organizations now focus on this as the right thing to do and are making headway on that basis.
Okay. Thank you, Dawn. This was brilliant and filled up with new ideas. Wow. And thank you, Julia. And before we start the discussion, I have to tell you that I am a sociologist. So I have to let you all know I'm a sociologist, and I am also an absolute beginner in all things diversity and inclusion. So bear with me, please. And the thing is, we have just heard about diversity and inclusion in human resource management, and we have had two different accounts on it, or of it. And it is clear to me that diversity is about being human. And that means, different ages, different physical challenges, different ethnicity and races, and different gender and sexual orientation, and the list could go on and on and on, but it seems okay. It's too long already. But being a sociologist, I see diversity as a fact, but I don't see it as a problem. And I see it as a fact that has to do with our condition as human beings, as part of humanity. And though it is not a problem, but apparently diversity and inclusion became problems ever since Johnston and Packer wrote that report on 1987, the Workforce 2000. And they put forward a number of ideas about or aiming to ensure the competitiveness of North America's economy for the new millennium. And they advised, for example, immigrant quotas because immigrants were likely to bring entrepreneurial spirit into the economy. They talked about integrate fully in the economy Black and Hispanic minorities because they could bring in creativity and talent and whatever. They also mentioned women should be fully integrated in the labor market and should be given conditions to conciliate work and family lives and all that stuff, because, and because. Many reasons, all of them having to do not with the fact that women, the Hispanic, the Black, the immigrants are all human beings and should be treated with decency, but because of their utility, you see. So without being aware, it was Johnston and Packer, they were just making the business case for diversity and inclusion, especially diversity at that time. They managed, one, to make humanity a means to economic ends, and they also managed to make this a very, very seductive idea. It is so seductive that 32 years later, here we are discussing diversity and inclusion in human resource management. Or in other words, how to put diversity into actions. And perhaps, just perhaps, it might be possible to reverse these instrumental views on diversity and inclusion for the better. And at this point, this absolute beginner had this most inspiring thought. Yeah. Much as we'd like, we cannot change the world of work at once. But perhaps, just perhaps, we can change one workplace at a time. And that would be smashing if we could. But okay, enough of this, enough of me. And it is now time to welcome your questions, this brilliant audience that we have. And we would ask, I think that you have to write them down on Q&A chats, and then if you want, you can write them in Portuguese, and then we'll try to translate and pass them on to our brilliant speakers. And thank you very much. Thank you. So shall we go to the Q&A? Questions? So we have a first one. I don't know. I think you're reading them, right? Dawn and Julia, if you'd like to take them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think the first question is effectively about quotas. Are companies recruiting people just to meet quotas, or because a person is really the best for a certain position? I mean, you know, the amount of effort that goes into hiring and the amount of problems when it goes wrong always lead me to believe that people are hiring for the best talent, basically. I do think that they are more focused on the diversity of talent. So my sense is, you know, that they are much more aware and much more open to the fact that, you know, that talent may look different, it may sound different, it may come from a different background, for example. But I don't believe that they are simply hiring to hit quotas, basically. I mean, the costs are too great. You know, you hire someone wrong into the organization, you're firing them in 6 months' time. The cost of a hiring process, particularly for someone at senior level, you know, so many people are involved in that process. It's so expensive in terms of time, effort, everything else that goes into the process, that, you know, if it goes wrong, you hire the wrong person simply by trying to hit a quota, then you're going to have to go through that process over and over and over again. So no, I don't actually believe they're hiring just to hit quota.
We also have a question from Evan. So I don't know, Julia, would you like to take it?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that Giangelo's work is really interesting, and I'm glad to see that you've looked at her book on white fragility. And I think she does have something to say regarding racism and, of course, and how we think about racism within the workplace, and addressing sort of some of the systemic issues around racism in the workplace. And And also this idea of from individuals, it's not enough not to have a workplace, if you can say such a thing, without racism, but to be anti-racist in our diversity and inclusion. So I feel like her work is really thoughtful and gives and really offers something to organizations in really sort of facing up to thinking about racism in the workplace. Dawn, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I think you've handled that well.
Okay, that's a really good question. And
so before moving to the next question that you can see, I have a couple of questions that you perhaps are not seeing because they're on the chat. So Sebastian is asking, do you see any risks or negative consequences associated with inclusion?
From my perspective, I see none. I really don't. I mean, I think inclusion is the optimal outcome here. One thing that we used to do many years ago, and I think this happens to some degree, and that many workplaces do, is they create networks. They create diversity and inclusion networks. So the networks are open to all, but they have a specific focus. So we had a women's network, we had an ethnicity network, we had an LGBT network, those types of things, basically. And I remember a managing director saying to me, I really think at the point where there's no need for any networks, we've succeeded. And I think that's true. I think that's actually quite true. So I don't really see any downsides to inclusion from my perspective. No, I think at that point in time, you've got ideally you have an optimally balanced organization, and you have an organization where everyone can actually demonstrate their worth and bring their whole worth to the organization.
And I think if I can just add, I agree with that as well. I think in the literature, there's sometimes a focus on the challenges of diversity management when it's not managed well. I mean, and discussion around, it's not just about having diversity, but it's about managing diversity so we can maximize the benefits and minimize, some of the challenges around that. So perhaps that's, I don't know if that's more what you were asking, but I mean, in general, no, I don't see any sort of disadvantages, as it were, or issues in that way.
Yeah, I suppose that the student was asking the question in general because it's one thing to talk about inclusion within the organization. It is another thing to bring this discourse into society as a whole, because then perhaps you might lose track of, for example, citizenship rights, because it just concentrated on including individuals and forget about, for example, the structures of power that are acting in society in general. And that are at the root of all these things that we now are discussing when we talk about diversity and inclusion and stuff. But I have a correction to make. I was not aware that those questions that you can read are not readable by our audience. So I will repeat. The first question was sort of, are companies recruiting people just to meet quotas or because a person is really the best for a certain position? And this was a question from Antonio Souza Cardoso. And then Evan Griffin said, "Hi, thank you both for a great presentation. What are your thoughts on the workplace seminars which primarily focus on white guilt and white fragility, specifically those that follow Robin DiAngelo work?" And now we need to move to another question on the chat that you could not see. And this is from Luis, and Luis is thanking you both for the presentation, and he's asking, for a more inclusive and diversity world, should we invest more in education or should we change the rules? What do you think?
I think it probably realistically has to be a combination of the two. I mean, education is key, but remember that the way that our brains work, we're hardwired to basically unconsciously think. So you're talking about changing a lot of thinking, changing a lot of views, changing things that have been culturally brought, a part of our lives basically, or a part of our upbringing, or a part of us. So I think the rules actually can help with that. So I think they actually go hand in hand. I mean, fundamentally it is about education, but I think the rules can bring a focus beyond the education as well. That's my view.
You want to add something, Julia?
No, I would agree with that view. Yeah.
Okay.
But it is both, I think, rather than either or.
So Rita Padrão is saying, as we know, if workers do not comply with the rules the company imposes on them, since the moment they are recruited, they will be subjected to sanctions. So how does the organization manage to balance compliance with these norms with the natural diversity of each person? Because by complying with the rules, you are reducing your individual freedom. So who takes this one?
I mean, I think it depends what you define by rules. I mean, of course, there are a set of, norms and rules that organizations require. Things like, not viewing inappropriate material on an internet. There are also, ethics procedures and things of that nature. But then, there are, if you like, accepted forms of behavior around the way that people interact. And of course, if people overstep those or step outside of those boundaries, then an organization is bound to act. And I don't think that's necessarily about restricting anyone's freedoms. I think it's about ensuring that everyone is acting in a way that respects everyone else within the workplace. So I don't think that's necessarily about a reduction of individual freedom. I think that's about recognizing mutuality and respect, basically. I'm not sure if that helps.
Okay, thank you. Julia, it's okay? Yeah, again, I think I would agree with Dawn's answer to that. I'm trying to think of maybe what Rita, the rules maybe that Rita had in mind in posing this question. So
Yeah,
I'm not...
it's almost a hyper individualistic view. We risk falling into some sort of libertarian world where any kind of rule will be an offense to the individual, will be an offense to your individual freedom. And so perhaps we should look for a balance here. We need to, but it's quite interesting.
Yeah,
and it's very interesting also to welcome Ludmila's question. What are your opinions about recruitment process for only diversity and inclusion? Do you think the candidate will feel bad or feel less valuable because it's not general? I don't quite see this, but then I'm a beginner in all things diversity and inclusion, but you're the expert, so you'll have to try to come up with your views on this. So I think that Ludmila is envisaging some sort of recruitment processes only for the purposes of diversity and inclusion and not for people in general.
I'm wondering if this may be a question, Dawn, around affirmative action.
Yes, that's what
the situation where you're not necessarily looking at the qualifications of the candidate, but more the background of the candidate. And this is always a controversial area, and it can be it's about sort of managing the perceptions, I think, and understandings within the organization, because I think that we wouldn't be recruiting only for diversity. We would still be looking for a candidate that had the required skills and qualifications.
Yes.
Yeah.
And even in Portugal.
Yeah.
Yes, Dawn, please go on.
I was just going to say, I think that's absolutely the key point. In fact, I was on a conversation this afternoon where we were talking about age discrimination, and someone was telling me that one of their colleagues who focuses on this particular area was trying to sort of develop a sort of a tick, a double tick basically for age positive organizations. And in fact, when they spoke to many people in their community about that sort of type of proposition, they really weren't interested. They didn't want it to be sort of singled out, if you like, in that particular way. They I think, to Ludmila's point, you know, they didn't necessarily want something that perhaps made them stand out in any way, shape, or form. So I think it is absolutely about not just recruiting to fulfill again the diversity quota. It's about going beyond, far beyond that, and looking for the right talent for the organization.
Mm-hmm. I was about to say that I fail to understand this, because in Portugal we have laws forbidding discrimination, any sort of discrimination. It doesn't mean that it's not put into practice, of course. One thing is the legal system, and the other thing is the company's practices, not always about compliance. So I failed to get it, but yeah, it is as you say. And there's this problem about diversity and inclusion, or which is that we are learning from textbooks and from papers that are produced in the United States, and refer to the United States context, which is a bit different from other contexts of other societies, especially here in the continent, in the old continent. I think that perhaps nowadays the United Kingdom would be closer to the United States, but it's still a different case in continental Europe, especially the European Union. So we need to tread a little bit carefully when we're using those theories and those concepts, because perhaps they are not always useful. So the whole idea of treating people decently, with decency, and as human beings, is something that comes from the Enlightenment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a new idea, and it's a good thing to insist on that, because it's only reasonable, it's only expectable, only rational, I think, only human. But it seems that we need to go further than that. But even I always tell my students to be careful about absorbing all those ideas without critically think about them. But this is my way I think it's not relevant.
I think that's
yes.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think a very important point. You know, I mean, a lot of the obviously in a multinational corporation where you're working, you know, across many countries, many cultures, it's very important to understand that, you know, what works in one country, you know, doesn't necessarily work somewhere else. And I think it's taken organizations a little bit of a time to get to sort of, I think, understand that. You know, so when you try and roll out some kind of, you know, European-wide or global kind of training program, clearly you have to have the right people work with you on that program, so that, you know, the differences are well understood. What plays well in London doesn't necessarily play well in New York. It doesn't necessarily play well in, you know, Porto or Lisbon or Paris or Frankfurt or whatever. You know, you do have to recognize those differences.
Yes, thank you. So now we move on to Catarina Moraes, and Catarina says, hi, thank you both for the presentation. Dawn spoke about how law helps reinforce diversity, but isn't law helping in terms of equality, but not necessarily in terms of inclusion? That is, I cannot discriminate, but I cannot hear them. But I can not to hear them, sorry.
Yes, thank you for your question, Katrina. I think you raise a good point, and I think what it's recognizing is that the law can only go so far. The law can, and again, Don, you'll come in, but it legislates for action, but not necessarily for the other aspects. And so when we talk about diversity and inclusion, often the phrase is that we're going beyond the law, that the law just sets a minimum standard. And then the work for diversity is efforts that go beyond that minimum standard.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's really going back to the question that we answered a couple back, which is the two work in combination. You know, it's all about changing behaviors. It's all about changing understanding. Remember, you know, we're dealing with human brains. We're dealing with unconscious thoughts, unconscious actions that basically go like that are there from, you know, years of cultural upbringing, family upbringing, school upbringing, whatever it is. So we can use education, but I think the law can provide a pathway to help us and support us in those efforts.
Okay, thank you. Now we have two questions from Anons. I don't think we should take questions from Anons, do you? We want people to reveal themselves, not to hide. So we go to Anna Regina. In your opinion, is there any downside in having diversity and inclusion in organizations?
I mean, I think we sort of spoke about this. I think really it goes to the inclusion question. I think that we addressed a little while ago. And I really don't think that there is a downside to having diversity and inclusion. I mean, you want to be open to the best talent. You want to be able to retain the best talent. And you have to have diversity and inclusion in order to actually achieve that. So I don't see a downside. The challenges, yes, there are challenges sometimes in managing it, making sure that you can bring the best talent in, you can actually retain that talent, make sure that talent plays its full role in the organization. But I see no downsides in having it in the organization. I don't know how you feel.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we have sort of discussed that there's a lot of positives. There are instances revealed in the research of backlash or resentment, particularly from majority groups. And so perhaps we need to manage that, but that's not a good enough reason not to pursue, I think, our goals for diversity and inclusion. Donna, I don't know in your own work experience whether you've had to manage resentments or backlash which can build up. Managing perceptions, I think.
I mean, certainly there were, there were issues. We created a gender network, and we did get some comments, from our male colleagues about those types of things, even though they were, they were open to them as participants, basically. So, of course, you're always going to get that. You have to manage it, basically.
Okay, we move to Mariana Perin. Do you think the changes and evolutions in terms of diversity, inclusion, and equality in organizations could start by their own initiative, or would it be necessary to create laws to encourage it?
That's a very good question, Mariana. Often, there are things organizations will do. There are things that they'll do when they're legislated. So, for example, in the UK, there's a requirement for organizations with 250 or more staff to publish their gender pay gap. Now, it's become compulsory for some organizations, and that has brought the discussion and, to a certain extent, some action towards reducing the gender pay gap. But without that sort of legislation, how many organizations would voluntarily make their pay and their pay gap transparent? So there is a role for legislation, but there's also a role for organizations to reflect on the social justice case, to appreciate the business case, and to reflect on the social justice case, and to invest in policies, procedures, ways of supporting diversity in them.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think, again, as we've sort of spoken about, the law can be helpful to tell an organization that you have to report on your gender pay gap, or you have to report on your ethnicity pay gap. I think all of those things contribute towards, shining a light on any potential issues. And sometimes organizations aren't even aware of it, or not necessarily aware of the extent of it. So I think by encouraging them to go through those processes, and if the law can encourage them to do that, then I think it helps them to keep that focus. Ultimately, it is about, providing that evidence base, basically, that action needs to be taken or may need to be taken.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Maria Carolina asks, what do you think we can do to improve inclusion and equality in a day-to-day routine in an organization? Should it start in with the managers or staff relationships?
I think that is an important starting point. I think managers understanding potential issues, potential sensitivities. It used to be the case that, if you were an LGBT person, one of the most difficult questions that someone might ask you was, how was your weekend? Because if they ask you that question, how do you respond if you don't want to divulge that, your partner is male or your partner is female? So, but I think managers can play a huge role. I think, they create trust, they create confidence, they create openness, they create welcoming, basically, and they also can play critical role models for the rest of the team, basically. So I do think that manager-staff relationship is very important, and the managers, have a lot to do in that space. What I think is important is that organizations recognize the role of the managers and recognize the potential tension that managers undergo, and that they're giving them the right degree of support to recognize, the different challenges that they may have. Managing diverse teams, for example, is a significant challenge.
I would agree with that. I think that from the academic point of view, the case studies, the research, often come to the same conclusion about how it's really important to have buy-in from the top. We can build from the ground up, but really for success, it is about having access and support to the top managers, not to feel marginalized in what we're doing, but to incorporate it sort of throughout and in all aspects of the organization. And that really, I agree with what Don said about providing the role model and sort of the context and the direction for the work in the organization. And yes, diversity and inclusion can be from the everyday things to the big strategic things. It's everything. Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, before going back to Catarina, she has a second question. I would get a question from the chat. Maria Beatriz Ferreira, she's saying, Professor Julia talked about the cancel culture we're seeing. I wonder if there's space in inclusion for this, because by definition, excluding these people is counterproductive. Nowadays, if people say something ignorant, they're automatically cut off.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And then she says, at the same time, it's important to correct them, and there must be a better way to do that. Also, could you explain what glass ceiling is? I'm unfamiliar with the term.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for your questions. And yes, apologies if I assumed understanding of the glass ceiling. Sometimes when it's something I'm thinking about every day and see it in the news sometimes, that I appreciate it can be missed. So I'll take the last point first. And the glass ceiling is a metaphor to refer to the inequality that we see in terms of having fewer women in top management positions. So it's often said that when you look to the top of organizations, pretty much in whatever industry or area you choose to, that there seem to be fewer women at the top. We've seen more women progress into the workplace, progress into middle management roles, but when you look at the CEO positions, the professors and, you know, the top professors in universities, there's more dominance there by men. And so there's a lot of discussion around the glass ceiling and about what causes the glass ceiling, if the glass ceiling is a useful metaphor or not, or if there are other metaphors that are better. But it's all trying to describe this, this phenomenon that we see. And so, yeah, so I think that came out through my presentation. I just mentioned that as an example. So as an organizational level, we'd want to look at our data and, you know, do we have something like a glass ceiling in the organization? Are there fewer women at the top? Don, you mentioned how within your industry, the CEO is a woman. And so that sort of metaphorically we say there's a woman who's managed to smash this glass ceiling. But it would be interested, if you're interested to read about that, there's certainly plenty there.
Oh, but sorry to interrupt you, Julia, about metaphors. Then Don will not confirm this because this is sort of provocation. But there's another metaphor. It's the queen bee. When the woman gets to be CEO, she becomes a queen bee. So much for metaphors. Sorry.
That's true. And not only are there glass ceilings, but people talk about glass cliffs and the glass elevator and the bamboo ceiling and the stained glass ceiling for the church, and just all sorts of metaphors, as well as a labyrinth and lots of other things. So yes, just trying to capture that reality. But interesting also because, yes, I mean, there is a culture war. It's just an interesting time to think about diversity with, on the one hand, we see forces within society, politicians, popularism, looking to not advocating for diversity, looking to more homogeneity within society or valuing that. And then on the other side, we have progressive views around increasing diversity, and there are these tensions that play out for us in the media and on our social media. So we do see instances where it's a reaction. Cancel culture then can become a reaction to a racist perspective or a sexist perspective. And you're right, then there's discussion around, is that the best approach? How do we handle this? Do we cut it off? Are we silencing people? Are we silencing certain views? Is that the way to progress the diversity and inclusion agenda? Or can we talk? Can we have that conversation? And I mean, it's been to certain politicians' benefits to stoke these fires, to encourage and to point out when it's a cancel culture. And in our organizations, we're operating within all of that and within the law as well. So yes, I think you raised some interesting points around that.
Any thoughts, Dawn?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, this is a very, very complicated issue, with quite difficult views. So yeah, I think that's right. I mean, on the one hand, debate, should be open, but I think people feels really find it very difficult to deal with these issues, and this is a very difficult time for some of those questions, I think.
Okay, so now we will take Geronimo's question, Geronimo Carrasco, and he's saying, from what I understood, the business case of diversity created incentives to bring diversity and include people in organizations. Why is that seen not as ethical if it helps to create a more ethical society?
That's another interesting point, a good question. Sorry, Dawn, were you going to?
I was just going to say, I mean, I think it just comes back to the concern that, fundamentally, are people being hired for the right reasons? What are the reasons behind people being hired? And I think, every organization wants to hire the right talent for its organization. And I think, if there is a concern that the right person hasn't been hired because they're not the right gender or they're not the right ethnicity or they're not the right sexual orientation, then that's always going to be a concern, basically. So it's about getting the right person into the organization. I think that's ultimately the end goal.
Yes, and I don't think the business case necessarily has to be mutually exclusive from the social justice case as well. There's an ethical dimension to both those, and there's scope for thinking about ethics within the business case. Certainly under the heading of, looking, there are links between corporate social responsibility and diversity. And so there is an argument around that, and whether it's not, indirectly or directly related to profit, but it's about ways of behaving and ways of being within the organization. So it's interesting to think about how we can incorporate ethics within the business case. And I think that's what we're seeing. It's not one thing or the other. I think there's more, as Don said, maybe it was more in the past focusing on profit, focusing on the business case, organizations saying, okay, so there's this diversity. What would be the business case? Why should I change the way I'm doing things? Maybe to bring on diversity and inclusion. You can say, well, it would be good for your profits. But beyond that now, I think there is a recognition of the ethics and the moral arguments behind it as well, and that's equally as important. So hopefully we can see these two cases complementing each other.
Okay. Should we move on?
Yes, that's fine.
Because we have a lot of questions.
We
still.
do. It's wonderful,
so,
all these questions.
Yeah, we do. It's very good. We're very fortunate today.
I'm impressed. You're a very impressive group of students.
Yeah. They're very smart ones, I think.
They are.
So João is asking regarding the diversity quotas, do you think we should have a goal to remove them in the long term?
I mean, I think as we've indicated, in most locations, it's actually, you can't have a hard quota. You can have an aspirational target. Should we have a goal to remove them? Assuming that we're getting the right people into the right organization. Again, I think the targets can be helpful to keep people focused, basically, to give people something to measure against. Again, I come back to the fact that, we are, as humans, we are imperfect creatures. We make decisions in a very hasty way. And unless we're constantly reminded that, we need to think about the decisions that we're making, then we'll continue to make the wrong decisions. I mean, COVID has shown us all that, right? So I think having the quotas there, or having aspirational targets, if you like, as I prefer to refer to them, is a way to keep reminding everyone, hey, think beyond, the end of your nose. Think beyond the way that you thought for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years or whatever. That's why I think the quotas are there and are helpful, just to act as a reminder.
I think so too. And it's, ideally, we wouldn't need, in one way, in an academic exercise, we could think ideally, we wouldn't even need diversity management, because people would be treated fairly and people would have equal opportunities. We wouldn't need targets, hard targets, soft targets, quotas. But we're not, and and our workplaces would be safe and comfortable, and people wouldn't be discriminated against, and people could come in and they could do their work and have the opportunities. And that's kind of the ideal. It'd be nice to work towards those ideals. So it would be lovely to have one day where we don't need to think in terms of targets. And I don't know if we'll achieve that. It's interesting to imagine that.
Okay, now we're moving towards the end. But we still have one or two questions to consider. So Maria Beatriz comes back and asks, how do we handle people who are intolerant, don't support inclusion? What should we do with them?
Well, I mean, from a workplace perspective, I think it's very simple. I mean, if an organization is going to talk about diversity and inclusion and espouse it as its values, then if there is evidence within a workplace context that is not, being supported, people are being intolerant, don't support inclusion from a workplace perspective, then I would expect it to be handled pretty firmly, to be honest. Obviously, beyond the workplace, it's a little bit different, you know. I mean, how do I know what someone thinks within the security of their own home, right? Like, I don't really know that. There was a great queen once upon a time who said, you know, I have no desire to make windows into men's souls. I can't see into people's heads, but what I can control is their behavior within a workplace context. So it's very clear to me that if someone is not supporting or in some way impeding someone on the basis of, a difference, then that needs to be dealt with very firmly.
Okay. Anything else you want to say? No. Right. We have a number of questions that are repeated. Again, with recruitment, we have Ludmila, and she's saying, sorry to come back to a recruitment question, but I'd like to confirm if recruitment can play an important role in diversity and inclusion in organizations, and if so, what practices this area can do in order to promote diversity, inclusion, age, range, and gender gap.
I mean, I think diversity plays a huge role. You know, to go back to my analogy of the tap and the plug, recruiting is where it all begins. What can I do? I think, again, as I've said, you know, certainly it's about sometimes starting early. You know, don't wait until someone is in university and making a decision about their career. You need to change the thinking much, much earlier than that. Because there are still stereotypes that persist about certain types of careers, right? Or there are still, I come from an ordinary background. I worked for some of the greatest firms in the world. I say to I know that there are people who think I couldn't possibly work for one of those firms. I didn't go to the right school. That's wrong. You know, it's about opportunity. Those firms now are very open, I think, and that, you know, that they will take people, different backgrounds, different ethnicities. I think that, you know, they have opened their minds from a recruiting perspective. But I think we need to meet them halfway. You know, I want people to believe that they can do those jobs. I want women to believe that they can go and work in banking. I want people from ordinary backgrounds to believe that they can become a partner in a big 4 firm. Then, you know, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The more people who believe that, the more people who apply, the more likely you are to succeed and climb up the ranks. And then you become that sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because then someone else sees you. Someone else, you know, sees Dawn as a managing director in Morgan Stanley or a partner in PwC and thinks, I could do that. So I think recruiting is at the heart of it. And it's about, you know, showing the role models, being very, very open in terms of the recruiting processes, making sure that the recruiting processes themselves aren't biased, and that the managers and the recruiters who are involved, and the AI, let's be honest, because AI is involved in a lot of recruiting processes, that the bias has been eradicated as much as you possibly can. That's my view.
Thank you. Julia, would you like to add something?
Oh, I would agree with that. And there's certainly a lot of literature around removing bias and sort of the techniques that can be used to scrutinize every process, you know, of recruitment and selection, from drawing up, you know, the specification of the person and the language that's used in the advert and where you're advertising, which websites, and you know, if there is an interview, to have a diverse panel and to rate candidates and all those kinds of practices that can be built in. There's also a lot of attention given to the unconscious bias training and whether that's effective or not. But certainly we would need to be aware that it can exist and how that might have an impact on our recruitment decisions. And also for it to be data driven, again, to have an evidence base to look at the types of candidates that are applying and the types of people that are being appointed. So there's a lot of work around the sort of diversity inclusion, is particularly around the selection and recruitment, of course. Yeah.
So, okay. I think we should call it a day. I thank you so very much for both of your contributions. This has been a very instructive session. Well, it's food for thought, at least for me, this humble beginner. And I would like to thank our audience, our students, and other people who came to listen to you and ask these brilliant questions. So thank you all, and maybe we'll adjourn another webinar on diversity and inclusion sometime. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the great
everyone.
questions.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thanks everyone. Really enjoyed it as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.